Congratulations on your film. In your own words, what is this film about?
Oh, that's a great question. This film answers a question that I've always had about running, and that is, why do I do it? Every once in a while, anybody who runs or walks or hikes has a moment, and that moment almost feels like a connection to nature or a connection to the universe. And it's such a shared experience amongst people who do run, walk, or hike that I wanted to kind of go to the heart of why we run.
And what conclusions do you think you've made through the film?
The interesting thing is that I realized across cultures, running can be a path to personal transformation. I mean, I'd always thought of running as something that would make you look good or that would make you healthier, but I never understood or knew that if you set the intention of using running to become a better person, it would do that. It almost doesn't make any sense. But, going back to these cultures that have been using running for those reasons for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, it seems like a little secret to who we are as human beings.
And how do you want the film to connect to people?
One of the reasons why we constructed the film the way we did, without experts, without statistics, without doctors, and even face-to-face interviews, is we wanted people to have an experience of cultures that are much older than our Western cultures, and in that sense kind of connect with a different side of humanity than they might experience day to day. So the film definitely isn't just for runners or for athletes or people who enjoy physical exercise or physical fitness. It's something to show us that even the simplest activity like running or walking can be a way to unlock a much deeper side of ourselves and a much deeper sense of potential.
You do have a theme in the film about Indigenous people having their traditions stripped from them or overtaken and obliterated. Was that something that you were seeking to put in the film, or is it something that you discovered while making it?
When we approached the Navajo, the Bushmen, and the Japanese monks, they all individually made it clear that they'd never allowed any outside group this sort of access to their running. And part of my process as a documentary filmmaker has always been to let the stories tell themselves. And so when we met them all independently, I basically told them what the movie was about, what the themes were, and I knew the basics of their running cultures. And I said to the characters, I said, our portrayal is entirely dependent on you. Like with Sean Martin, I said that we wanted to do something that's spiritually and culturally significant in terms of running, and I had him give me a bunch of ideas. We chose three or four. We ran them up the pole with the Navajo elders, and they picked one for him to do, and we went from there. It just so happened all the similarities on every level, from the spiritual aspects to the culture to the human rights aspects. The overlap was merely coincidence.
But you do emphasize the loss of identity and tradition of, say, the Navajo people or the people in Africa.
Well, we couldn't avoid it. And so, as part of my own process, I never like to shy away from the story. And so, that the elders on the Navajo Nation said to us, the story that we want you to portray is Sean running in honor of his father. And, we want you to portray this aspect of Navajo tradition, and, the modern Navajo experience of loss, and Sean paying homage to that through a long run.
you concentrate on four races. There's the 3,100 mile race going around a half-mile block
Yeah.
in Queens, New York, which sounds insane. And you've got the Navajo runner running in tribute to his father. You've got the Japanese Buddhist monk doing 1,000 day walk, which is extraordinary. And you also have the African tribesmen uh, being stripped of their right to run and hunt. Now, these were four traditions of running. Are there a lot of others?
There aren't. That in North America, and I would imagine this is pretty similar in with the Aboriginal cultures in Australia. But in North America, the indigenous people didn't actually have horses until the Spanish brought them in the early 1500s. So for the more than 10,000 years of their existence, when they needed to pass messages or trade, they had runners run very, very long distances. So the natives in the southwest of the United States are probably the least molested and the least kind of like, even though the impacts are severe, they've been the kind of least devastated by the forces of the U.S. government and colonization. And that area of the U.S. is where there is a lot more indigenous running practice, but there's not much in other parts of the country. And in Africa, there's just a handful, maybe two other tribes in the entire continent that traditionally hunt and gather. There's a few in South America. There's a few, in Southeast Asia, but in the jungles, they don't really run. They just, they hunt and gather, but not with running as a practice. So, we did our research, and apart from, the Southwest in the United States, there really aren't many other cultures or indigenous cultures that still practice running.
I don't know if this was intended, but your film, while it explores the theme of striving and pushing yourself and endurance, it also makes a couple of points about limitations and the importance of recognizing your limitations and, frankly, excess as well. For instance, the Japanese monks who do these 1,000 day walk, if they fall short of their spiritual transcendent goal, they have to kill themselves. And also, you have the runner in the 3,100 race who's obviously pushing herself beyond sensible limits. Was this an intentional theme that you put in the film? Because it's certainly there about recognizing, when to stop.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned both of those stories. So when we constructed the film, we saw the similarities between the Austrian cello player and the Japanese monks, and every time we see the Austrian cello player on the course, her story is followed by the Japanese monks, or vice versa. We cut from the Japanese monks to her because of that idea of commitment. Now, the suicide issue, it's a very Zen thing, not a Zen is a very Zen Buddhist thing, not the aspect of committing suicide, but the aspect of having an uncompromising condition. So, for example, like Jim, let's say you did the 1,000 day trek, and at like day 880, you sprained your ankle. And I was the headmaster. I was the overseer. I would say, like, Jim's a great guy. We don't want to lose him, so let's make this an 880-day trek. And immediately the quest has been diluted, and so they feel by having an extreme um, condition that's unbreakable, they can maintain the purity of their quest. It doesn't have to be suicide, but it's a very, very kind of Zen Buddhist thing to have that philosophy across across disciplines. So no one's actually had to commit suicide in the last 150 years because they've been a lot more focused on the preparation. But in the past, there's definitely dozens, if not more, that have had to end their life.
Now, you make the connection between physical fitness and running and spirituality and transcendence and this ability to take your mind to another place. So, Sanjay, how does that fit with the obesity epidemic and this obvious widespread reluctance to do exercise and to run? What does this say about
You
culture
know,
today?
it's a great point. Again, it's like a lot of people that I know who've run recreationally and who haven't enjoyed it. When if they come back to it with the intention of just using it to be happy, not using it to like look a certain way or to compete with other people or to do races or to measure their own progress with other people. If people realize that they can run, or walk or hike in a way that will radically change their outlook on life. I've seen people, of all ages, of all weights, of all, creeds get something out of it. The fact that people are unhealthy when there's such an easy and simple tool like running or walking mean to me it means that we've kind of lost that cultural or spiritual element of motion. People look at it as a discipline, people look at it as a chore. It's something that's difficult because we've kind of divorced the practice from the idea of happiness. It's just a chore. And it's not that everybody who goes out and runs, walks, or hikes can find happiness, but there's a prescription to using these types of motion activities to become a better person, so to speak. And that's what we see. That's what I learned. I mean, I never did it for that, but that's what I learned by kind of spending time with these indigenous cultures. That running was a medicine, much more than just some sort of hobby or pastime. And when you're sick, when you're obese, when you're unhealthy, you learn to take that medicine.
Now, I know that as a documentary maker, you need a structuring device, and you've used the 3100 race as the through line for this documentary. The one criticism I have of the film is that there's almost too much emphasis on that race that the other races that you show, especially the Buddhist one and the story of the Navajo guy, are so interesting. I kind of wanted to see more of that. Did you have more material?
Well, so it was interesting. We filmed the 3,100 mile race in the summer of 2016, and we began production on the entire film in March of 2015, and that that also included some development trips. We were kind of forced to do the Kalahari shoot first because we knew that access would basically disappear if we didn't go there right away in June, July of 2015. We didn't get permission to spend time with the Japanese monks or to shoot actually with the Japanese monks until May of 2016. So that happened before the 3,100 mile race. And we only had effectively 2 days access with the monk on the mountain. We spent 2 weeks rehearsing shots, and effectively, we realized by that time that we had to almost storyboard the entire movie. We did that. We shot the Navajo piece before the 3,100 mile race as well. But again, it's like with the Kalahari Bushmen, we didn't have the kind of unfettered access that we'd need to because we were constantly trying to evade rangers. With the monks, we only had 2 days, and with the Navajo runner, we basically only had a couple of days with him as well because that's how long the quest took. So we could have spent a lot more time with Sean the Navajo, but at the end, we realized that the 3,100, since we hadn't shot it yet, it needed to be the spine because we only probably had 90 minutes of footage with the Japanese monk. Even though we were in the Kalahari for 3 weeks, we only had about 12 hours of footage. So it was more an academic kind of film study of what sort of structure could these stories, could link these stories. And obviously it was a tandem narrative film. But the interesting thing was, and I'm not saying this to sound like some like cinema studies expert, but we really modeled this film off of Alejandro Inarritu films like Babel, like 21 Grams, stories that have characters connected by themes, but not necessarily by time and place. And the one thing we realized, from the very, very, very beginning, especially after spending time with the Kalahari Bushman, is that the reason why his movies work is because there's always one central character that's not on screen, and that's death. All of the characters in his movies, their through lines are motivated by the idea or the fear or the imminence of death. And so when we went to film with the monks, it was easy that their idea of enlightenment or death was in their conditions. With Sean Martin, the idea of his father almost dying and other Navajo kids dying was part of it. But then with the 3100, we really had to bring out that idea. And it just happened naturally around the Austrian cellist's demise and her near-death experience. But then we also had to pull out Ashby Hanal's initial motivation of the death of his mother. So, as loosely connected as these stories were, the one central element that I think made the film, I'm not saying it made the film great by any means, but it made the film possible, was death. And so we really had to pick and choose the aspects of the side stories that really focused on death more than culture. We actually, not to monopolize your time, but one of the early versions of the film, you know basically started with Sean Martin. We did have a lot more footage of his life, of his family, of his commitment to his community, but the rest of the film didn't work when Sean was the through line. His story worked better when it was much more focused on death rather than his role as a community leader.
Okay, I'll let you off. Mate,
It
final
was a
question.
hard thing. Like we didn't know how the 3100 would end, and in that race, even though it happens on a city block, we couldn't mic everyone. We couldn't shoot it like a reality TV show with cameras everywhere. We tried to make the block as cinematic as possible. So across the entire production, I don't think we shot more than 45, 48 total hours.
The timing of your film, given its themes of transcendence and spirituality and getting in touch with yourself, probably couldn't have come, ironically, at a better time given what's going on in the world. How do you register
Interesting.
and digest the timing of the release of your film?
You know, I since life is so topsy turvy, and I know from my running friends in New York that it's not that difficult to kind of maintain kind of a sense of our forward momentum, because much of the idea of running or walking or hiking is in fact self isolation and going within yourself. At the same time, it's a great question, because the cultures in the film have been around for tens of thousands of years, and just the mere reality that humans are survivors is one thing, but number two, that we can develop a connection, a sense of oneness through our shared connection with Mother Earth, for example, with Father Sky, like Sean Martin, I think gives this day and age a much it kind of gives some roots to the simplicity that we're all forced to live in. So you're absolutely right in pointing out the timing of it, and hopefully people will realize that there's a few things, positive things that can bind us all together. Obviously, COVID-19 is binding us all together, but at the end of the day, running or walking or hiking is something that you can do with anybody anywhere in the world and not speak the same language and have a meaningful shared experience. And hopefully people feel that kind of sense of connectedness with other parts of humanity as we've portrayed them in the film.
And just quickly, can you just tell me about your background with running? When did you start? How many times a day do you do it? How long do you run? And what difference it's made to you?
So I used to be a semi-competitive runner, but I hated it because it was all about winning and losing. And then I kind of got jobs and became a consultant and contractor in the human rights and humanitarian aid field, and didn't really run again until I started making this movie. And after it launched in the US in 2018, I decided to kind of try to put my money where my mouth was, and instead of just thinking and talking about running, but in these ancestral traditions, putting it into practice. And as a 45-year-old, last December, I ran a 2:37 marathon at a race in Sacramento, California, which kind of placed me in the top echelon in the U.S. in my age group. Um, and it was because of the inspiration that these other characters had really given me.
What is New York like at the moment? Does it really look like
Oh,
those B grade science fiction films where the streets are empty and it looks all eerie?
put it this way: today, Thursday, our time, we surpassed 20,000 cases in New York, which is more than 20% of our entire country, which just surpassed China. We're not on an Italian or French military style lockdown. I mean, you could never really do that to New Yorkers, but the streets are totally empty. Traffic, which is normally like you always feel like you're in Southeast Asia or China with the traffic here, traffic is totally non existent. The hospitals here are already overwhelmed. In my local hospital, they've run out of morgue space, and they've brought in refrigerated grocery trucks to store bodies. I mean, the bodies aren't piling up by the thousands by any means. It's not Zombieville yet, but we know that things are going to get worse. But the thing about New York is that people have a really, really strong sense of community. So everybody's kind of here for each other, as strange as that might sound in a city of 8 million people. We all have faith in our mayor. We have faith in our governor. We don't necessarily have any faith in our national leadership, but our local and state leadership is really, really strong. Our community is very, very resilient. But we're getting to the point where the next stage is going to be like a zombie horror show.
Have you been tempted to go jogging in these empty streets or are you staying
Yeah,
inside your
no, no.
house?
The great thing is that our mayor and our governor know that, like, people in New York would go crazy if they were forced to be cooped up. So we're allowed to exercise in a solitary manner, and because there's no traffic, I mean, these we've got great forests outside of New York City, and they normally take an hour to get to, but now without traffic, they just take 25, 30 minutes. So I make it a point to actually go out into the woods for an hour and a half or so of jogging or running a day. Everybody in New York is actually getting into much better shape than they've ever been in. I mean, I see it on social media everywhere, where if people aren't, going outside for their walks or jogs or bike rides, they're signing up for online classes and spending a couple of more hours a day than they ever would trying to get into shape. So when this is all over, I think collectively New York probably would have lost like 1 million kilos, and people will, in our case, we're coming up on summer, people will have beach bodies rather than what we joke as the quarantine 15. Like, people aren't going to gain the 15 pounds in quarantine. I think most people are going to get into good shape.